Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics and your host. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. Charles Finlay is the executive director of the Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Brittney Kerr is the founding partner of Framepoint Public Affairs, and Kyle Harrietha is the former chief of staff to the Natural Resources and Energy Minister and president of DOPA Services. Thank you all for joining us. It's been another busy week in Canadian politics, so we have a lot to go through. That being said, I want to maybe start with what's been kind of the talk around town here in Ottawa, and that is the Prime Minister's video on Sunday. The headline that we all read, aside from, the figurines and the references to Isaac Brock, was our ties to the U.S. have now become a weakness. I don't know if anyone would say it's a radical kind of reworking of some of his messaging, but once again, it seems to be this doubling down that I don't know if you want to call it adversarial tone of the U.S., but definitely we have to limit our exposure to the Americans. I'll start with you, Charles. What's your take on that messaging, and how do you think it will resonate with Canadians?
Listen, I think it was a pretty direct talk from the Prime Minister. As you observed, not anything particularly unusual in terms of content, but the tone was striking. The figurine of Sir Isaac Brock was striking. And one is left thinking that this Prime Minister is preparing Canadians for some challenging times ahead. We can wonder what the Prime Minister's calculations are in respect of the renegotiation of, obviously, the free trade agreement that is coming up and, other things that the Prime Minister is seeing on the horizon. So, for those of us who've been following what the Prime Minister has been saying, I don't think that there was anything in particular that was new. And in fact, some of it was fairly standard, but the tone of the conversation was really, really interesting. And I think something that we should all take forward. Listen, I think that Canadians are in the mood for direct talk. I think Canadians are in the mood for a direct conversation and understand, for the most part, what's on the table here. So I think it has gone over reasonably well. We'll see, obviously, as the fall progresses, how events transpire.
I mean, Charles makes a good point. Of course, we can't forget about the timing as we rush through that CUSMA review timeline. Brittney, to Charles' point, it seems like the Prime Minister is setting us up for something. Is that a no deal with the U.S. and potentially harsher tariffs? Is he setting us up to kind of swallow our medicine on this front?
Well, I would not pretend to be in the Prime Minister's head on any of this. July 1st is some time away. As anyone who's worked in government, it's a lifetime away, particularly when you're dealing with this U.S. president. Anything could happen between now and then. But Marco, I think you're right in terms of, I do think it was a moment to sort of level set for the electorate following the Prime Minister having secured a majority. And as you say, sort of casting forward to the CUSMA renegotiations that are going to maybe happen on July 1st. Or maybe not. But, in terms of the format of the video, I thought it was a good one. I mean, we've seen the sort of long form vlogs. I guess Pierre Poilievre really started doing these, some time ago, some years ago. And I thought it worked for the Prime Minister. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I was kind of, was I hanging on to every word? I was certainly plugged in and tuned in. And as a millennial, ability to get distracted easily is pretty renowned. And I tuned in for the entire thing and I was paying attention. So I thought it was a great format for him. But yeah, let's hear from Kyle and others before I talk too much more about Canada, US, because I think there's a lot to dig into.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brittney, I only watched the video with one other movie playing in the background. Kyle, what's your read? Like, again, just same question. Is the Prime Minister trying to set us up for a potentially bad deal, or sorry, not a bad deal, excuse me, maybe a no deal on CUSMA and potentially the consequences that would come with that?
I think overall, he's maintained consistent messaging with the United States, going back to when he was first sworn in as Prime Minister and into his election victory. He's used stronger language actually before. He's referred to what's happened with the United States as a betrayal, and he's done things in other forums. Like Brittney, I thought using YouTube and doing long form was a good format for him. I think it will have a broad reach. You've already seen a number of clips come out of the come out of that as well. I thought it was very well produced. I thought the historical references were on point, and the evoking of 1812 imagery was
Which we all, of course,
certainly a deliberate choice. And he did it right after the by-election. So I think he's looking to set out a new tone now that he has secured a majority. And, he's re-emphasizing messaging that people may have forgotten about over time. We're dealing with an unpredictable interlocutor with the U.S. Administration. It's currently distracted, obviously, with wars that it has started in other parts of the world. I think we could see very unpredictable things. And we're starting to see that with Howard Lutnick's comments, and that they've walked back a bit, but in the last couple of days. So, yeah, great format. I thought he communicated it well, and now he needs to start delivering on those things he says that we need to do in response now that he has a parliamentary majority.
What do you guys make of that, though? Charles, I'll start with you, because Kyle brings up a good point. It seems like the Americans are also getting a bit scrappy. We had the ambassador on last week, and he wasn't shy about, taking issue with the tone from Canada, the tone from the Canadian media in particular, but also wondering why the Canadians seem to be, kind of crapping all over the Americans, considering the importance of that trade relationship. Are we kind of matching fire for fire? Like, what is going on there? It seems like everyone's kind of settling in for like to use a hockey analogy, a chippy and scrappy game. Is this just us trying to set the tone for what's going to come maybe in the second or third period?
Yeah, it could be that. I mean, I think the Americans who are saying that they don't understand why Canadians are reacting the way Canadians are either being disingenuous or naive, frankly. The economic damage, just to make the obvious point everybody knows, to Canada is serious and could be very, very serious. And the sense I got from the Prime Minister's comments during his talk was that, he's preparing Canadians for sacrifice as this process moves forward. I think he may understand, and like Brittney, I don't pretend to get into the Prime Minister's head. I have no idea exactly what they're thinking. But given what's happening with this administration in the United States, they may think that they aren't going to get to a deal, in which case they need to position Canadians properly for that eventuality and for the economic impact that that's going to have. So yes, I think things are very aggressive. The comments from the U.S. administration on a whole variety of issues are unbelievable if we hadn't already been prepared by so many previous years of this happening. And we could have, as I say, really, really challenging times ahead. And I think politically, the Prime Minister is getting his electorate ready for that.
Yeah. And, I'll go back to you, Brittney. What do you make of that? You're talking about, kind of setting the tone, but also, like when do we kind of need that reality check? Because I don't know if anyone is saying that somehow we're going to, erect a wall, on our northern border. Like we still need to have that relationship with the Americans. The Defense Minister Dave McGuinty was up the other day, and I asked him about whether this rhetoric was hurting Canada's defense and security cooperation. Unsurprisingly, kind of deflected on that, but I'm just wondering, like, we're not going anywhere. We're not going to move neighborhoods. So we do have to deal with these guys. How do we kind of balance these two kind of opposing views?
Yeah, unfortunately, we cannot move. That is true. And so without question, the relationship, the Canada-US relationship is one that we'll have to endure, for a long, long, long time. But I mean, I think it would be fair if Minister McGuinty or, the Prime Minister or whomever, I think it's fair. I think that the posture Canada is taking is one that Canadians view to be a reasonable one, given everything that's happening. I don't need to sort of, rehash everything Canadians are following and everything Canadians understand. But, the defense industrial strategy that the Prime Minister announced with Minister Joly and Minister McGuinty, I do think that this will be sort of a landmark legacy policy from this government. I think Minister Joly has talked about that just in terms of, what will her legacy be as an industry minister. I think building out our capacity as a country in this way. I mean, I don't know if we've ever done that. Certainly not in generations. We have not seen this level of spending or investment in our defense space. Of course, we all know we've never met our 2% GDP commitment to NATO. And, the Prime Minister proudly stood in Halifax and announced that Canada did just that. Before March 31st, that March 31st deadline was looming. And I think a lot of folks were skeptical, can we meet that? And I think the prime minister, come hell or high water, we were going to meet that deadline. I think it was a personal priority for him. So, I think, it does feel like a sort of a brave new world for us as Canadians. And I think that, it's going to continue for at a minimum the length of the U.S. president's term. But, beyond, I do think to some extent it's been irreparably damaged.
I mean, Brittney, you brought up deadlines, and, I don't want to sound like I'm picking on the PM, but that was one deadline out of a few that he has hit. We had that July, whatever deadline on a Canada-U.S. trade deal got pushed to August 1st. We didn't hit that. The defense industrial strategy came in like 3 months late. I do wonder, if that in itself is not a reflection of maybe a change in tone. Early on, it seemed like, guys, let's go down to Washington. Let's really kind of get some, momentum going. And ever since that deal that we had at hand in the fall seemed to fall apart, seems to be a totally different messaging. And now we're seemingly hearing only whispers about conversations. What is that? Is that just them saying, look, we clearly aren't getting a good deal here. We have to stop making this a focal point and maybe shift our focus elsewhere where we can actually have some wins. Is that a fair read?
Well, my understanding from the July 1st sort of milestone is it's when the parties are scheduled to get together to review the agreement and decide whether to extend it for 16 years or not. I guess if that doesn't happen, it kind of continues in effect for 10 years with these annual reviews. Now, that's pretty technical. What does the electorate understand that milestone or deadline to be is sort of the more important point. And I do think, to your point, Marco, a lot of them are waiting with bated breath for what could potentially happen by or before July 1. So that'll be something from, I think, more frankly, a communications exercise than anything. I would be curious, Kyle's perspective on the point around that you made, sort of deviating a bit from July 1, but thinking about, how quickly they are moving as a government. We had 1 year where I think the prime minister was effectively operating like he had a majority. He has one now, and I think there's a lot of sort of parliamentary maneuvering that can now take place, be it with committees and so on. I think, Kyle, you can speak a lot better to the parliamentary procedures than I can. But I think, this is sort of where the rubber hits the road, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, what do you read on that? Did we see a big shift from the Carney government and maybe signaling, hey, we're not going to get a deal here, so let's start pivoting to things that we can actually secure as wins?
I mean, look, the United States is our geographic neighbor. There's no getting around that. Ultimately, it's in our country's interest and the prime minister's interest to continue to, at best, maintain managed coexistence with the United States. We're very large trading partners with each other. It's manifestly in the interests of the United States economy to have good trade relations with Canada. I think you've seen aggressive strategic hedging by the prime minister in terms of his global travel to Australia, Japan, India, Europe, and China over the course of the last number of months. A number of deals or commitments to get to a deal have been done. We're hearing about a trade deal with Mercosur now. Well, at least we're hearing that from the Brazilians. So I think the prime minister has been aggressively, and his cabinet been aggressively courting the rest of the world to hedge against our unpredictable friends south of the border. I do think, people have talked about Canada's tone, elbows up and all of that. I think Canada's tone has been very respectful. I think it's been very reasonable. I think the lack of capitulation on the part of Canada has frustrated certain elements of the Trump administration. But, that's too bad. Canada is not just going to roll over for a bad deal. He needs to advance things where he needs to legislatively now that he has a majority. But I think you were going to bring that up in a bit, so I won't get too far into that.
We'll start there, and I'll stick with you, Kyle. Got a majority. What changes? Because I get the thing being like, look, now there's maybe a bit more oxygen for the Liberals to kind of, push forward legislation, but it doesn't seem like we need much on that front, in terms of moving the needle on trade negotiations. I know eventually if there is a deal made and it requires any sort of changes to our laws, we'll have to put in some sort of implementation bill. But, if you're whispering in Carney's ear, you got the majority now. I know you have a myriad of interests just beyond Canada-U.S. trade in terms of top the priorities. What do you do with this newfound majority? What's your advice that you would offer them?
Well, majorities are as good as they are to have, because you can do a number of the things that are very, very difficult to do in a minority. I a parliamentary affairs director the last time the Liberals had a majority. That was a far less experienced government at that point. It had just been elected after, 10 years of the Conservatives, but majorities are harder. Well, they are harder because you have to deliver. You don't have the excuse of, well, the opposition is blocking it. Oh, they made these demands that we can't meet. Like, you have to get your legislation drafted. That takes a lot of work. You have to ensure that no mistakes are made. The stakeholder interventions take on a lot more increased prominence. The public's view of legislation can send governments sideways. Governments will sometimes overreach in terms of what they're doing when they have a majority, and caucus, as opposed to opposition members, take on much greater importance. You only have a 1-seat majority usually on committees, and if you have caucus members that don't like certain elements of things, you have to spend a lot of time with them to manage your way through the parliamentary process. We'll see how things go in the Senate, where obviously the government does not have a majority. I think that'll be interesting to watch, but overall, it's going to be delivery. It's, putting into law or changes to the law a number of these concrete changes that the Prime Minister has been talking about. He's talking about like structural reforms of the that might be required with the Canadian economy. He's talked about a number of other things as well that will require legislative changes, and the pressure will be on to make sure these things are drafted in time, are in the right state. And, when you rush, you can make mistakes. When you don't move fast enough, you're accused of not delivering. It will be tricky, but it's certainly a better place to be in than in a minority where the government could theoretically fall at any time.
Kyle, you kind of said my trigger word, and so much stuff on the Senate and the machinations there. But I did want to get Charles in here. Kyle's talking a lot about kind of the delivery challenge you get in majority government. One thing that struck me, I don't know, Charles, if you agree with me, but when the PM was listing what he could do with his newfound majority, I thought the kind of legislative things he was pointing to was a bit of a, thin deck of cards. It was Build Canada Homes legislation. He's talking about the gas tax cut, which was broadly supported in the House. So I do wonder, to Kyle's point, if you're talking about these big structural changes, what do you have to do to kind of set that up to look like a success for the Canadians who maybe not Canadians who maybe, might get lost in the weeds of some of these big changes that you're putting forward, if that is the route that he wants to explore?
Yeah, listen, I think that obviously it's easier to, operate the government with a majority than it isn't. But to Kyle's point, it's by no means easy. Many of the objectives which this government needs to achieve aren't necessarily legislative objectives, they're implementation objectives. I mean, the defense industrial strategy is, and I agree with Brittney, I think it's a momentous move for Canada. I think it's very, very important, but it relies on bureaucratic shifts within the operation of the government that are fundamental. I mean, it's not going to make any difference if, for example, D&D procurement doesn't significantly improve, if we can't drive innovation through the economy in important ways. So certainly, I think that for all the reasons Kyle mentioned, having the majority is important. Carney is, I think, doing the right thing with videos like Forward Guidance, with direct communication to Canadians. And in continued direct communications to Canadians, I think he's got to set out what success looks like for him in quite specific terms and repeat that all the time, and then achieve that through funding and through implementation and through really moving his government very, very aggressively and in new ways, frankly, against timelines that it may not have previously been used to. I just want to make one other point on CUSMA. The Prime Minister's, and again, we can't get in the Prime Minister's head, but the Prime Minister's stern perspective may be because he doesn't think that we're going to get a great deal. It also could be because he understands that a deal may not mean anything. This U.S. administration is different in kind. They are not afraid to tear up deals. And that's a fact. So even if we get to a good result with CUSMA, it may not matter from one Truth Social to the next. So that may be why we're hearing this perspective from the Prime Minister.
Charles brings up a great point. Deals at President Trump's statements only ring true as long as someone else isn't in his ear or he doesn't see something he dislikes and changes his mind. But I guess, Brittney, I'll ask you this question. I think obviously there's a lot to do and a lot that the Prime Minister has laid out that he wants to do in terms of reorienting the Canadian economy. I don't know what the kind of receptiveness from the Canadian public will be, like whether there'll be great excitement about, he keeps using terms like, oh, we're going to, unlock, new parts of our economy, talking about things like a trade diversification fund. I don't know if they have the same sort of salience with the Canadians that maybe some things that were done under the Trudeau government were. So I do wonder, how do you work that comms exercise with some of the stuff that you're talking about, in terms of, reorienting the Canadian economy, don't really seem to have the same sort of sex appeal factor that, other governments could have had at their disposal.
Sex appeal. I wonder if that's what they're talking about every day in PMO. Yeah, that's the nut to crack for sure. I mean, so much of what is sort of central to their mandate are really big macro sort of adjustments, more shifts. And how do they translate that to everyday Canadians from sort of a, quote unquote retail politic standpoint? I mean, folks still think about grocery prices. They still think about housing. They still think about, I think maybe not inflation as much anymore, but these are still things that dominate, probably conversations around the dinner table. So yeah, that's definitely the communications exercise, as you say, that they need to do. I think that, I wouldn't be, in terms of the sheer amount of change that I think the Prime Minister is trying to drive. I think anyone who knows him or has, even just read about him, I wouldn't describe, patience as being one of his strengths. This is a man who talks openly and freely about wanting things to happen fast and to affect change quickly. And, Charles made the point that we're talking about trying to move a bureaucracy that does not know how, and I'm generalizing, so I say that with respect, but like as sort of like a machine, it just can't function that way, or it hasn't for a long time. So yeah, I mean that's going to be, I think, Michael Sabia's job, obviously, the role of staff to try to move this stuff across the finish line. I guess my final comment on this would be around myopia in politics. There's so much that you want to do today that will bear fruit tomorrow. And when we're operating in election cycles that are, as short as they can be, taking that long lens is really tricky. You're not often rewarded for doing that in politics. Now, of course, having the majority will hopefully offer a runway where, the Prime Minister has time to demonstrate the progress that he wants to make. But it's hard. It's really hard in Westminster style democracies.
I would just add too, like there's a big parliamentary communications exercise coming up next week with the spring economic update. So, I mean, this is all happening after the Prime Minister has secured a majority in the House of Commons. So that's going to be a big test. It will be interesting to see what sort of budget implementation act is associated with the spring economic update as well, how broad the changes are, whether he's putting it all into the BIA or whether it's going to be broken out a bit into pieces with some of the legislative changes they may be contemplating. So that's a week today that's coming, and it's going to be also interesting to see how the opposition responds to that and how the stakeholder community across Canada, provinces and territories as well will respond to that.
Oh, Kyle, you were kind of in the lion's den for the last few years of the Trudeau government, and the Conservatives are already pivoting to maybe a kinder, gentler tone under the first few months. I mean, more cooperative, maybe I should say. I should qualify that.
Maybe a couple of weeks ago, I feel like.
Is that over now that the Liberals have their majority and the Conservatives can get away with taking those shots?
I feel like Pierre Poilievre can't help himself. And what we were witnessing over the last month was a bit of a comms exercise. And if there's not an improvement in the numbers, he will revert to that thing that he feels he does well and does effectively. And to be fair, it was quite effective for a while. I mean, but if you go back even further, like when we had the majority, the Tories used very aggressive parliamentary tactics. They shouted down. They tried to shout down then Finance Minister Bill Morneau in a budget presentation. They forced all-night votes on the estimates and that sort of thing. Whether they'll go that aggressive in their parliamentary tactics, I don't think so. I don't think the public has an appetite for that. But I mean, you've seen it in the last week with Poilievre questioning the Prime Minister's economic credentials, which I thought was risible. I think we'll see more of that from Polyev because I think his leadership is actually potentially in
That was
danger.
going to be my point. Yeah, I think the numbers, as you say, Kyle, like what do the numbers show will obviously inform his approach, his strategy. I mean, I'm hearing, yeah, like it's pretty grim right now. And yeah, will he be here 12 months from today? Not sure.
I don't bet on Polymarket, but it would be not a bad bet.
I would have loved you to say Marco had the Liberals winning the next term in office in December 2024 on Paul.
I still thought so, but that was hope springing eternal as opposed to it's well placed, but as it turned out. But anyways.
Shifting gears a bit to the provincial scene, Charles, let's talk about gravy planes. Speaking of responding to outcry, Premier Doug Ford is backpedaling on his plan his government's plan to purchase a private plane. It obviously, was met with an outpouring of criticism from the public. He tried to defend himself yesterday. We were joking earlier that this is pretty common for this premier, and he kind of acknowledged that on Monday, saying, "Look, if I do something that doesn't land well with the people, I'm not above reversing course." Is this time different, or is this people just going to be like, "That's just Doug Ford doing Doug Ford though"?
Yeah, I'm not sure that this time is different. Listen, this premier has established a relationship with his voters in Ontario that is really resilient, and they trust him. And he admits mistakes when they happen, and that's what apparently has happened here. Obviously, the premier's critics have really made this an opportunity, and properly so. I mean, this lands in the middle of a real affordability crisis for lots of Canadians. It lands in the middle, obviously, of significant budget deficits in Ontario, etc. I'll just tell you, as a staffer provincially, I flew on King Air, which is the current plane that they have. What do I know? It is due for an update. You can't really talk on it because you can't hear, anybody saying anything. Having said that, timing is everything in politics, and I think everybody now agrees this is the wrong time to be buying jets like this in the current circumstances.
Kyle, what do you read? Like I said, this is, Charles makes a good point that, maybe the premier had a good point, but, the backtracking, is this ever going to catch up with this guy?
I mean, I haven't seen him do a backflip this quick since he tried to close down playgrounds again during COVID. It's about the same timeline in terms of his reversal. The difference here is he actually bought the plane already. The memes on this have been spectacular. I mean, like Air Force One and the gravy plane, like, wow. It's been a field day on social media for opposition parties, and taken as well with like releasing offenders accidentally and stuff like that. It has not been a good couple of weeks for Doug Ford. That said, as Charles pointed out, Doug Ford does have a relationship with Ontarians. He's been an electorally very successful premier. He has a good sense to know. He has a pretty good political sense to know when the winds aren't with him. He usually knows that in advance, but he quickly reverses himself after. Does Ontario need planes? Probably. I think, but they didn't communicate it. They only got one, which made it pretty clear it was probably just for the premier. If he was going to use it for medevac or ferrying up firefighters to Northern Ontario and that sort of thing, he perhaps should have thought about getting a few more and then having it as a side thing, having it for VIP service where required. Certain parts of Ontario are only accessible by plane. They're very hard to get to. Charters can be very expensive over time as well. So was there a case to be made for this? Probably. Did he even attempt to make that case? He didn't. And so it's a it's a lot of a black eye for him on this one. This stuff is cumulative. Will enough of it stick eventually that it will hurt him electorally? I mean, the polls haven't been that great, but he's still in the lead. If there were another election, he's against, an NDP party that's not doing well in the polls, that's official opposition, and a Liberal Party that still doesn't have a leader. So in the interim, no, but he's got to be careful the closer he gets to the election, because the weight of these things will eventually cost him as he goes for a fourth majority. It's been a while.
Both you and Charles alluded to with the communications not being great. Is this like a form of politicians senioritis where, they're just like, he's just not in the game. He's not kind of hyper focused on how this would land. Like, is this an unforced error?
It was definitely, I mean, they didn't even try to communicate. It was the result of a leak to the a leak, I'm assuming, or the Star doing good investigative work, breaking this story, and then them being completely in reaction mode. He didn't start trying to justify why he did it until after he had reversed his decision and sought to sell the plane. So, and then relating it to a double standard with other premiers, I thought or other provinces, was pretty weak sauce in terms of a defense. I think he'll be, and the legislature is sitting as well, so he's going to be under pressure in the ledge where it doesn't sit that often, and when it does, he tends not to do quite as well.
But Marco, if I could just jump in on this is one of those situations that, clearly I have no idea, but I would think that the premier and his team obviously think that this was a mistake, but it's going to be quite quickly overcome by events. I mean, this premier has made his name in Ontario, certainly in his last term, as being a champion for the Ontario economy in terms of the tariffs imposed by the U.S. administration. And if we head into a rocky CUSMA renegotiation, and a difficult situation, he's going to have a lot of opportunity to reprise that role as sort of Captain Canada, which was very successful for him. So, he has plenty of time to make up this ground, and he'll have his opportunities to do it. Obviously, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Charles, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like, both the Prime Minister and the Premier have a lot to win or to gain from being, kind of this trade war with the U.S. In terms of the political calculations.
Yeah, I think that's right. But both Kyle and Brittney have made good points, which is, there's one thing about being sort of strong and having a position as a Canadian leader of our sovereign independence and our own economic strength. But Canadians don't want to be foolish about the United States. Everybody knows that we need to partner with the United States. We need to sell to U.S. markets. We need access to that market. So Canadians want to be strong, but they don't want to be foolish about this. And that's a line that both leaders are going to have to walk over the rest of the year and beyond.
Yeah. No. Speaking of premiers who are caught in a flip-flop, Brittney, I'll start with you on Premier David Eby's UNDRIPA saga. I don't know what we're going to call it at this point. We're going to do something. We're not going to do something. I think we're at the third or fourth flip-flop. Can you kind of explain to me how this has become such a political football for this premier, and if there's any way to pull himself out of that nosedive right now?
Well, let me start for your listeners just to say that there are national implications to what is happening in British Columbia today, particularly like whether it's DRIPA, the bill, the legislation out here, or just the relationship with Indigenous peoples and the Crown. There are massive implications broadly, including to how, we as a country want to pursue major projects and nation building kind of initiatives. Where do you begin? I mean, Premier Eby, what a tough spot. Don't know how we got to this point. I think, he's probably scratching his head a little bit on how he got to this point. There have been a lot of false starts. As you said, Marco, I think some people would describe it as flip-flopping. Even over the course of just 24 hours alone on Sunday, there was just, so much activity. We're going to do X, and then all of a sudden, within 45 minutes, nope, we're going to do Y. The media was reporting one thing, and then they'd have to turn around and issue corrections because developments had emerged that meant things were changing. It's definitely really problematic for the premier. And this is a man who, for those of you not familiar with the BC premier, is a reasonable, thoughtful, smart man. And he has, I'd say his favorables are dropping for sure. That's what public opinion research is showing us. But he's also governing without effective opposition right now. The official opposition is undergoing a leadership race. We'll see the results of that in about 5 weeks, at which point I really question what the political landscape in British Columbia will look like and what that will mean for David Eby and over the coming, months and really months. So I guess the too long don't read. The TLDR is that the government has decided as of yesterday that they will not be introducing legislation to suspend or amend DRIPA in this spring legislative session. So yeah, it was a definite surprise and a reversal of what I think most British Columbians are expecting to happen. So we'll see how this plays out.
I don't want to get too far away from the actual issue at hand here, but from someone who's not in BC, it seems like both of these parties the two major ones, the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives, are going through like this existential debate. Like obviously suspending UNDRIPA is going to fractures within the BC NDP coalition. The BC Conservatives are in the middle of a leadership race, like you alluded to. There seems to be some debate there about how conservative they should be, whether they should be a broader, more appealing to center voters who previously backed the BC Liberals. Can you kind of give me a lay of the land on terms of what this kind of political realignment, if there is one in BC, may mean for EB in
Well,
the future?
I'll say one thing, and I think, my Liberal colleagues will agree with this. The BC Conservatives under John Rustad ran in a provincial election when the Conservative brand in Canada was at an all-time high. So, the same reason that the BC Conservatives were calling the NDP during that election, I think they were saying it was an EB Trudeau, like the EB Trudeau party, like they were trying just so hard to, to rub off on EB in that way. I mean, Poilievre he brought a lot of energy and excitement to the Conservative brand in British Columbia. So what I would say is this: I think, and I guess I hope as a centrist, that the BC Conservatives understand, particularly whoever becomes leader in a very short time here, that they have to appeal to a wider segments of the electorate. To date, they have been extremely insular. They have been completely disinterested in broadening the tent, so to speak. And on the inside, from an insider perspective, there's that classic conservative purity test. And that exists for sure on the left within the NDP as well. But, are you a true conservative? Are you conservative enough? There has not been room for anyone outside of that sort of really small kind of segment. So anyway, my answer to that question is more a personal one, which is for the sake of British Columbians and what I view to be good politics, I do hope that they consider broadening that. And as you say, realigning what being a conservative might be in an effectively two-party system right now in British Columbia.
It's been fascinating to watch from the sidelines and seeing people accusing each other of being BC Liberals as if the party that they kind of displaced. But Kyle, obviously, you have experience in both these issues. What do you make of, firstly, to Brittney's point, the Premier's decision on UNDRIPA and what it means for maybe his political fortunes?
Look, he's in a very legally complicated situation. There was a court ruling that effectively took the DRIPA law, and it's been seen to create issues with land tenure and British Columbia and certain types of regulations, including mining regulations. I think that came as a surprise to the government of BC. It's hard to believe they thought a law would be purely symbolic. Most laws, all laws, typically aren't. It was going to have some effect, but I think it's certainly had a more dramatic effect than they anticipated. The Conservatives, the BC Conservatives, have certainly driven some misinformation, I think, around this as well. It's created some alarm among the public. There was also the Cowichan decision as well, which has created, they don't have treaties in most of British Columbia either, except in the problem. I think the mistake that EB made, I think, was getting out over his skis in terms of talking about suspending or amending certain parts of DRIPA without first engaging with his First Nations partners in BC. That certainly caused a very, I would say, aggressive reaction, not a surprising reaction, given DRIPA was passed, I believe, unanimously, if I'm not mistaken. Brittney, you might know, but certainly with overwhelming support in the BC legislature when it did pass. So, I think he's taken a decision that he had to take, which was to step back, engage in consultations with First Nations, and he didn't have his caucus behind him. It wasn't clear. Well, it was clear that he might not win the vote in the BC legislature, which would, on an issue of this importance, trigger an election in British Columbia in the middle of a leadership that was happening on the Conservative side. So it's not pretty for him, but I think he made the right move to take a step back and see what can be done. There will also be appeals on the legal side as well. This issue is going to have a long shelf life for either EB if he continues on as Premier, or for the Conservatives if they win. And their rhetoric's been quite over the top in some cases on this. We'll see if it changes after the Conservative leadership, but TBD on that front.
And it has just become a political football because there is that conflation of the Cowichan decision somehow connecting to the implementation, of UNDRIPA? Because I don't think those two are connected, but is it just because in the public's mind, there's a lot of uncertainty?
I think it's all the same in the public's mind, more than likely, and you have some partisan politics driving some of this as well. And Indigenous First Nations government relations in British Columbia have almost always been more complicated than in BC than in other parts of Canada.
And Charles, what's your read in terms of this massive flip-flopping? We're talking about Doug Ford, but in terms of David Eby's situation, he might be giving our premier a bit of a run. Charles, I was just going to say, what do you make of Eby's decision, and the political balancing act of trying to win over, maybe a fretful caucus, but also try to appeal or try to address some concerns from the broader BC public?
Listen, I defer entirely to Brittney and Kyle's analysis. I'll just say for myself, more of a personal perspective than a political one, that I hope it doesn't damage the reconciliation program and process across Canada, which obviously has made important progress recently. So that's all I would.
Well said. I think that is the real takeaway, for sure.
Thank you all for joining us, Charles, Brittney, and Kyle. Very, very helpful. We had a great convo. And everyone for listening. Same time next week. And this has been iPolitics, No Talking Points. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone. Bye.